Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast. Now, I've asked Arnold Schwarzenegger along to introduce the podcast, as long as he doesn't wake my neighbours up.
Hi.
Bloody hell, Arnie. One job!
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
In movies that had stories.
The story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, given away in the title, I'm here to talk of the stories of film. And I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, all the bits and bobs, really, that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. Now, the films I tend to choose for this podcast, they lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to punch down. I try not to do snark. I just want to celebrate the fact that films get made. It's really hard to make them. I want to salute the people who've got them over the line. Enough preamble. I'm going to crack on with the first of the two films I'm talking about in this episode. Let's go back to 1993. I'm going to play you a clip from the movie, and I'll come to the story the other side of this.
Something is rotten in the state of Denmark, and Hamlet is taking out the trash.
Stay thy hand, fair prince.
Who said I'm fair?
No one's going to tell this sweet prince good night.
To be or not to be? Not to be.
That then was a clip from one of Hollywood's most notorious blockbusters of the 1990s, Last Action Hero, directed by John McTiernan. Screenplay eventually credited to Shane Black and David Arnott, with story credit going to Zach Penn and Adam Leff. And the cast, what a cast: Arnold Schwarzenegger, F. Murray Abraham, Art Carney, Charles Dance, Frank McRae, Tom Noonan, Robert Prosky, Anthony Quinn, Mercedes Ruehl, Austin O'Brien, a whole fleet of cameos, everyone from Tina Turner to Sharon Stone. And, well, really, I mean, quite a story behind this one. Now, the story of Last Action Hero, and I'm indebted to James Robert Parish's book Fiasco, which tells a little bit of this, as well as a premiere article, How They Built the Bomb, which gives you a rough idea where this is going. It began with Zach Penn and Adam Leff, a pair of screenwriters who graduated from Wesleyan University, and they were looking to break into Hollywood. They were teaming up to do their stories. They'd not had a lot of luck. They'd written a pair of scripts together that hadn't broken through. So they decided to have a look at what was selling, and they landed on films such as Lethal Weapon and Die Hard and movies of that ilk. Action films that had a comedy edge to them. Not only was Hollywood buying them, they were hits at the box office. So why not come up with something along those lines? But what they actually came up with was something a little more ambitious, with a little bit of a nod to a Woody Allen film, The Purple Rose of Cairo. And in this case, it's the story of a young film fan who would get sucked into the screen and join the big screen adventures of his action movie hero, Jack Slater. He would become part of the movie within a movie. And so by the back end of 1991, they'd penned this script. I think it was around October they finished it. They also, crucially, landed themselves representation through a company called Intertalent. The film at that stage was called Extremely Violent. It'd been deliberately written as something overtly commercial, and they hoped that Hollywood was going to bite. And who else would bite first than Carol Co.? Now, Carol Co. in the late 80s, early 90s was routinely making the world's most expensive film. It had done it with Rambo 3. It spent a fortune on Total Recall. It had spent a lot of money on Terminator 2 Judgment Day as well. And it was an independent that was not shy of spending a few quid. And so the script for Extremely Violent went to Carol Co., but it wasn't really interested in it. Nonetheless, there were ingredients here that were crucial, because Carol Co. had been instrumental in making Arnold Schwarzenegger the biggest movie star in the world. And the big question in Hollywood as we got to the end of 1991 is, how would he follow up his biggest film to date, Terminator 2 Judgment Day, to this day one of his most loved movies? And Hollywood was desperate to lure Schwarzenegger to a new action film. He was doing another comedy, done Kindergarten Cop, but what was his big action return going to be? Well, Schwarzenegger wasn't massively in a hurry, and he's turning round a film every year. That slowed down a little bit. He was going to take a little bit of time away, but also he was linked to a Carolco project called Crusade, directed by Paul Verhoeven, who'd helmed Arnold Schwarzenegger in Total Recall, and so Carolco was looking to get that off the ground, and Schwarzenegger was mulling his options. He was keen to do that one, but whilst that was bumbling along in development hell and it wouldn't ultimately get made, every Hollywood studio was trying to line up an Arnold Schwarzenegger project, with perhaps the exception of Disney, which was going through one of its frugal patches. So, Into Talent decided to play on this. With Carolco and its checkbook not interested, what it decided to do was the age-old trick of the time of send the script round to lots of studios, set a deadline to get your bids in, and try and get people to into some kind of auction. And it worked. In fact, it worked a little bit too well as far as Sony Pictures was concerned, because Sony would just, well, it wasn't called Sony Pictures at that point, but it had taken ownership of Columbia Pictures and TriStar Pictures as well. It had acquired Columbia and TriStar off Coca-Cola and had been in town really for a couple of years at this point. And it ended up with a bizarre situation where Columbia and TriStar were bidding against each other for Last Action Hero, even though they had the same parent company. So basically, Sony found itself bidding against Sony for the film, and in the end some common sense prevailed, which brought the price back down actually. Columbia purchased the script for $100,000 up front, with $350,000 extra if the thing got made, and into development it duly went. So who would star at this point? Well, inevitably, Columbia quite liked the idea of luring Arnold Schwarzenegger over to the studio, and this was its chip at the table to try and get him back to action cinema. And to Columbia's delight, he was interested. Now, it helped too that times were changing a little bit. The world had just gone through the Gulf War, and so there was an emphasis on over-violent films in Hollywood, that things needed to be pulled back a little bit. It also helped that in the early 1990s, movie stars were said to be looking for more caring, sharing roles, that the big violent movies of the 80s, well, they felt a little bit out of step now. You've got people like Harrison Ford trying their hand at something like Regarding Henry for director Mike Nichols, for instance. And Schwarzenegger was wary. He was wary of putting too much violence on the screen. He was looking for a project, a big blockbuster project, that just had a little bit more of a family-friendly edge to it. Now, what Schwarzenegger wasn't was in a hurry. He wasn't making a decision at great speed. He was mulling a film called Tooth Fairy at the time. He was going to do a comedy next. Now, that was going to be made with City Slickers director Ron Underwood, but ultimately would appear a long way down the track with Dwayne Johnson in the lead role. I wouldn't dig it out. But what happened in the end to push Last Action Hero to the top of his pile was a lunch meeting that was called in January 1992 with the bosses of Columbia, and this demonstrated that Arnie was leaning towards this project. What a coup this would be. Now, Schwarzenegger wasn't too happy with the script. He didn't think it was quite there at that point, and Columbia, sensing it was about to land its man, agreed straight away to the rewrites. Why wouldn't you? The world's biggest movie star, off the back of his biggest hit to date, was interested in your movie. So Columbia decided to hire Shane Black, who Schwarzenegger had known from his role in Predator, but also Shane Black had written films like The Last Boy Scout. He'd written the first Lethal Weapon, and he trousered $1 million to do a rewrite of Last Action Hero to make it a bit more suitable to Arnie. Now, Black spent a bit of that money bringing David Arnott in to help him out, and now this film was not a PG-13 fantasy. It was more swearing, it was more violence, it was a bit more standard Schwarzenegger stuff, albeit with the fantasy elements still in the background. There's no way this was going to be a PG-13 movie. Now, while that was going on, Columbia was trying to sweeten the deal further and reel Schwarzenegger in, and it began exploring directors. Now, Schwarzenegger had worked with Paul Verhoeven before, and he was busy, and so he wasn't available, but Columbia's plan was go to people he's worked with before. By this point, Schwarzenegger was engaged with the conversations, and so they landed on John McTiernan. Die Hard director, but crucially for the purposes of this, he directed Predator with Schwarzenegger, and he was interested. Now, he turned down an earlier version of it, but when he saw the Shane Black rewrite, which was a little bit more insane, it'd be fair to say, he was interested, and he was taken with that, and he signed on the dotted line, and this dream package was coming together. The problem was that the clock was ticking and Columbia was looking to launch this in the summer of 1993. It wanted this to be its big movie. You couldn't release a big Schwarzenegger action film at this stage outside of the summer. And so the rewrites were ongoing furiously at this point. I mean, one draft had the old man who sells the young kid a ticket to the cinema as the devil, and that had to be pulled back. Schwarzenegger wanted rewrites of that. And who do you get in? Well, the top name, the top script doctor in Hollywood at the time was William Goldman, screenwriter of things like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, of course. But he was the top person to go to if you wanted your script rewritten. Now, Goldman was busy. I mean, initially he turned it down, but this was more and more a project that had the hand of Schwarzenegger on it. And it was Arnie who rang Goldman up and asked him personally if he would take a look at the script. And that's, in the end, what Goldman agreed to do. I mean, he got $750,000 by way of compensation for it, and he spent a month working on the project. I mean, little things that he did. He changed the projectionist character, turned him into a friendly old man who was ultimately played by the late Robert Prosky. He took out some of the jokes. He made it a bit more of a buddy film. And by the time Goldman had completed his work, well, Schwarzenegger was interested. He was in. And there were still people who were coming to do work on the script. There are lots of writers on this one, 5-6 writers that are known on this one in the end. But even though it's a little bit of a hodgepodge, Schwarzenegger was happy. Columbia was more than happy. What an enormous signing this was. Instantly agreed to a cheque for $15 million to Arnold Schwarzenegger. Yes, you can have a cut of the profits. He would also get, crucially, an executive producer credit on this and approval of pretty much everything. Now, Columbia's boss at the time, a man called Mark Canton, was absolutely adamant he was going to push this as the big film, the big movie for 1993, and that would be at the heart of the film's marketing campaign. Now, the problem, the first of many problems, was that this project couldn't be announced until August 1992. And that's when Canton brought together the staff at Columbia and confirmed they got Schwarzenegger. He brought Schwarzenegger in. He rallied the troops. He also announced at that point that a June 1993 release date was absolutely locked in. If there was a fatal error with the Last Action Hero story, that was it. He absolutely put in cement this release date. This movie was going to come out on June the 18th, 1993. They were already at August. And even in the background of this, there were questions just being raised within Columbia of like, what actually is the film? How do we sell the film? How do we push the film? And while those questions were going on, the plan was for tie-in video games, for albums, for toys. Let's get Burger King in. They can do a tie-in promotion. And who wouldn't want to sign up? Who wouldn't have written the check for the new Schwarzenegger film at that point? The lure of the size of the project and also presumably the salaries concerned, that brought together a respected cast as well. F. Murray Abraham, remember him in Amadeus, Charles Dance, Mercedes Ruehl had just won Oscar for The Fisher King, Sharon Stone agreed to do a cameo, Danny DeVito came in and did some work. They even introduced an animated character in the midst of this one. And Schwarzenegger went through his contacts book really and called people in, and who wouldn't agree to help? Lots and lots of people joined in. This was the big ticket for 1993. Schwarzenegger was given a huge trailer on the Sony lot, and the key decisions of the film would see a bunch of executives go in and out of that trailer, Schwarzenegger signing off with things. And in the midst of all of this, filming could actually begin. Now, it started on the 2nd November 1992, and it took in lots and lots of locations in and around the Hollywood area, as well as filming on the Sony lot. And it was going to be an intense and fast and difficult shoot. But whilst John McTiernan was wrestling the movie, the problems were starting to mount. The questions were starting to mount. And going back to that Premiere article that I mentioned at the start, one of the things it zeroed in on, and this has been talked about in one or two other places as well, is something as simple as coming up with the poster for the movie, because Schwarzenegger wanted approval over this, and he didn't want guns on the poster. He wanted this to be softer. This was nicer Arnie. He wanted a hand-drawn Arnie with flowing hair. He didn't want that harsh robotic look from Terminator 2. And furthermore, Columbia was looking at other ways to push the movie. I mean, he infamously spent $500,000 to have the name of the film put on the side of a rocket heading off into space. It tied in that Burger King stuff. The Albert, all of these bits and bobs were going through the works. But the shadow just in the background of it all was they were becoming increasingly aware of a rival movie that was due out the week before. Now, this was a film that had been off a lot of people's radar. It was called Jurassic Park. You might have heard of it. Now, it's been directed by Steven Spielberg, and Spielberg was coming off the back of a couple of movies that had underperformed. 1991's Hook hadn't done the business that was expected. Still a hit, but it remains to this day the film that Spielberg, in interviews, talks ill of, really. He'd done a smaller film called Always. That hadn't really taken off. The Indiana Jones sequel had a few years before, but it had been several years, really, since Spielberg had a hit movie. Jurassic Park had no stars in, was a bit more of an unknown quantity. So it had staked out that release date ahead of Last Action Hero, but at the time, Columbia was just brassing this out. We've got the big film. That was the message that was being thumped out. But there was no wiggle room in the schedule. They couldn't give Jurassic Park that much attention, even if they wanted to, and filming went on. Now, Schwarzenegger, in his memoir, Total Recall, he does devote a little bit of time to Last Action Hero, and there's this passage in there. And he describes on the set, we were having a drink after shooting until 3 a.m. one night in New York. And John McTiernan said, what we're really making here is E.T. And Schwarzenegger admits, when I heard that, I had a sinking feeling that maybe the whole PG-13 thing was a mistake. Even though we had a kid co-star in the movie, that would be Austin O'Brien, people might not buy me in a family-friendly action film. Now, that was okay for Harrison Ford, Schwarzenegger writes, in Raiders of the Lost Ark, but not me. I'd made the comedies, of course, but those were different because no one expects you to blow people up in a comedy. When you're selling a movie with the word action in the title, you'd better deliver some. He argued that the second Conan movie had fizzled out because they'd made that PG. And he said, now we're betting we could pack in enough amazing stunts and energy to make Last Action Hero live up to the name. Well, the shoot was frantic and the shoot was ongoing, and it wrapped up at the start of April 1993. And that's when further problems kicked in. Now, against the backdrop of this, as Last Action Hero is going into post-production, the signs for Sony elsewhere in its slate were looking quite good. That In the Line of Fire was due out that summer, and that was testing well. Had a film that it had a sneaking suspicion might be a breakout hit, Sleepless in Seattle, that was lined up for later in the summer. But all the talk was still about Last Action Hero. I mean, Columbia sent Arnold Schwarzenegger to the Cannes Film Festival. There's an image from that was widely published around the world of him laughing at a dinosaur. Schwarzenegger was front and centre of the promotion. He was in full-on promotion mode. In his memoir, he talks about how in 24 hours he did a personal record, 40 TV interviews and 54 print interviews. Ominously, the rocket launch that had been planned, that was being delayed. There was also a huge inflatable Arnold Schwarzenegger that was put up in Times Square, and that didn't go to plan either. But still, while that was going on, there was just about time for one test screening of the film, and one of Hollywood's most infamous test screenings, as it would turn out. Now, this took place on May the 1st, 1993, just over a month before the film was due to be released. And the premiere article, which is also talked about in Nancy Griffin's book, Hit and Run, well, it was set to be an event, a crowning glory, really, for Mark Canton and his summer slate. In the Line of Fire had tested really well at his Lucky Cinema a few weeks before, and so that's the one that they were going to go to. Now, John McTiernan had problems here because the film had only finished shooting a month before, and even though they had a team of editors working very, very long hours, the cut that they had of Last Action Hero to put in front of a test audience just outside of Los Angeles was very very, very, very rough. The kind of state that all concerned have gone on to admit you should never sell a movie. Still, about 1,000 people were recruited for this test screening. They weren't told what they were going to watch. And so in snuck Schwarzenegger, in snuck Columbia top brass into this screening. And the film was introduced. What you're going to see is a work in progress of a new film from Arnold Schwarzenegger, and the place reportedly absolutely erupted. The crowd couldn't wait to see the new Schwarzenegger summer film. The film got underway and the crowd was completely with it, but not all the way through. Because the film was in a state, and that deafening noise at the start was petering out by the end. And as it went on, they didn't need to know, the Columbia team, that by the end credits, what state their film was in. The film was sinking on the screen in front of them, to the point where Mark Canton went and reportedly grabbed all the test screening cards, and Columbia did not put out the scores. Now, it's fairly commonplace that scores for test screenings would make their way into the Hollywood press, that the various Hollywood outlets, the Variety, Hollywood Reporter, would ring up and ask what the scores were. But here, there were no scores. Well, that's unusual. What's going on? And so in comes the Streisand effect. Now, the Streisand effect, if you're not familiar, is an infamous case where Barbara Streisand took legal action to stop a picture of her house appearing in publication. But because she'd taken legal action, everyone suddenly knew where her house was. By Mark Canton withholding the scores, and the only film that summer I'm aware of that did withhold the scores, that made the story. All of a sudden, Columbia had this film that it wasn't talking about, that previously it hadn't shut up about. Schwarzenegger talks about the test screening in his memoir. He said, by the end, the audience was bored. And he said, after that, the schedule was so tight that we ran out of time for more tests. And instead, we were forced to fly blind without the feedback you need to fine-tune a movie. But Canton was adamant they weren't delaying the date. And Schwarzenegger notes nobody at the studio wanted to postpone the opening because that might create the perception the movie was in trouble. And I agreed. But they did still get some reshoots out, very, very, very late reshoots. They did re-editing, they beefed up the action side of it. They changed the third act around a little bit. But by hiding the scores, that was going to come back and bite them on the backside. Now, the Los Angeles Times published an article about the screening called Phantom Screening. You haven't heard the last about Action Hero, which in the end, as it turned out, it contained quite a lot of inaccuracies. But the thrust of it was in the ballpark, and it would actually lead to a feud between the studio and the Los Angeles Times. But also, that was it now. The negative word was out, and it started to steamroll. Other outlets picked up the stories of this mysterious test screening that a studio that had previously been beating its chest repeatedly about its Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, well, it couldn't go quite enough on him. All the while, in the background of this, the noise for Jurassic Park was getting louder and louder and louder and louder. And as the premiere for Last Action Hero took place, and that was on the 13th of June 1993, well, Jurassic Park was in cinemas off the back of rave reviews and early reports that this was going to make an absolute boatload of money. In more than one sense, Jurassic Park was an absolute monster hit, and Universal, which had shifted its release date before Last Action Hero, was so buoyant about its film that it held back a good chunk of its advertising dollar until the second weekend, when it would be up against the big new Arnold Schwarzenegger film. When the film went in front of reviewers, it did not fare well. And this partly a case that this was a big movie star up for a kicking. Once you've had the big high, you want to knock them off the pedestal, and they knocked them off the pedestal. That the reviews were, they were borderline hostile in many cases. That a couple of people saw that it was trying to do something quite ambitious, but also it was such a mix of different styles that, well, how can it really work? And the feeling was it was a bit too long. It wasn't playing to an Arnold Schwarzenegger audience. It wasn't actually clear what the film was, and it never really got over that. Furthermore, that poster with Arnold Schwarzenegger just wasn't playing to Arnold Schwarzenegger fans. That fear that Schwarzenegger had expressed in his memoir about a PG-13 action film, well, that was becoming realised, that the audience wasn't going along with what they wanted to do. And so it got to the point where the movie had a day of previews and then was launched fully into American cinemas on June the 18th, 1993. And the film, I mean, there's no way around it. The film got absolutely battered. It had cost by the end somewhere in the region of $85 million to make. Originally around $60 million, but all the extras and all the last minute tweaking, the bill just kept going up and up and up and up. And so it opened, and how about this for an Arnold Schwarzenegger film in the early 90s? It opened in second place. Last Action Hero never topped the box office in the US with a really disappointing $15.3 million. Now, to put that into some kind of context, the week before, Jurassic Park had opened with a record $47 million, and in its second weekend, Jurassic Park did more than double the money of the new Schwarzenegger film. Another $38 million in the bank for the dinosaur movie. Apparently, I quoted in Empire at the time, was an anonymous source at Columbia saying, why didn't we buy that dinosaur book? And so Last Action Hero then fizzled from that point on. Its second week, it lost half of its audience. And here was an Arnold Schwarzenegger film that just wasn't connecting. In the end, it would gross just $50 million in the US, a colossal disappointment for Columbia and a personal disappointment and a half for Mark Canton, mitigated to a degree by In the Line of Fire, but then also that was a shared production with Castle Rock. Sleepless in Seattle would come along and make money as well, but he had been adamant the release date couldn't move. He had fought for this project, and this project was just falling apart in front of audiences. Overseas, the name of Schwarzenegger earned it another $87 million. So worldwide, the gross of the movie, $137 million. And at the time, that was a loss. That was said to be a loss of, about $20-30 million. I'd suggest since then, it's gradually built back some of that revenue. But the problem was, this was not the huge star Arnold Schwarzenegger vehicle that Columbia was looking for. And the aftermath of it all was a blame game, really. One that ultimately led to changes at Sony Pictures. Schwarzenegger would cite the bad press reaction to the movie. And he would also cite the election of Bill Clinton as the new president of America as well as a factor, that Clinton was seemingly bringing in this new era of caring and sharing, and the old kind of action stuff was just seen as a little less palatable. And all of these things were in Schwarzenegger's eyes, contributory factors, as well as that PG-13. And as much as it's commonplace now for studios to chase a PG-13 rating to make the audience as wide as possible, that was just not palatable for an Arnold Schwarzenegger film at the time. John McTiernan was fairly was sanguine about it, really, as he considered it after the film's release. He talked about how they felt that they had a pretty good story, they had a pretty good script, but it just got hyped and hyped and hyped to death, and then it was rushed into cinemas within weeks of the finishing of shooting. In the aftermath of the film's release, once that blame game was done, Schwarzenegger went back to, not necessarily back to basics, but certainly back to someone he absolutely trusted. He would reunite with James Cameron for the following year's True Lies. His last absolute standalone action hit, I think, that's not been part of a franchise. John McTiernan would go back to the Die Hard franchise as well for 1995's Die Hard with a Vengeance. But Last Action Hero, whilst it was slammed at the time, I remember going to see it at the time and thinking, this isn't as awful as everyone's telling me. It's almost a bit of the Hudson Hawk effect, really. Whilst it was slammed at the time, in the years since, it's built up an audience that, personally, I think it's a film that's got problems. I think by the time it gets to the final act, it's sort of running out of steam. But there's a lot of imagination. I think Last Action Hero is a really bold 1990s blockbuster. And it's continued to sell for Columbia. It continues to reissue it on lots of different formats as well, and I don't think it would really do that if it felt it wasn't going to make a few quid off the back of it. And as much as the movie was absolutely blasted at the time it came out, won Razzies, but Razzies, bleh. There's something to the film, and as in terms of ambitious blockbuster star vehicles, for whatever reason it came together, there's just something in Last Action Hero, to the point where, as recently as 2019, Schwarzenegger revealed that he was open to the idea of starring in a Last Action Hero 2. Now, I don't see anyone stumping up the cash to make that anytime soon, but here is a tale of yet another infamous Hollywood flop of the 1990s. And you know what? The film isn't as bad as people might lead you to believe. Quite the opposite. Which brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. Thank you, as always, for listening. I'm just going to do my usual parish notices at this point because I'm in the midst of doing 2 new issues of assorted Film Stories magazines. Film Stories issue 32, I'm in the midst of doing now. Just put that up for pre-order. And Film Stories Junior, or Film Junior, as I'm going to be calling it soon, issue 9, is heading to the printers just a couple of days after this podcast is out. So you can find those at store.filmstories.co.uk if you're interested in those. If you like this podcast, there are 3 ways you can support it. The bits that cost you no money whatsoever are if you can subscribe to it at your podcast home of choice. That makes a huge difference to us. Likewise, if you can leave ideally a hugely positive review, and if you want to financially support what we're doing and help pay for materials for it, help us pay for new writers to come through on the Film Stories website as well, we're at patreon.com/Simon Brew, and thank you to everybody who supports me there. But now I'm going to go from a box office disappointment to a huge box office hit, but I'm going to dial us all the way back to the start of the 1980s. Let me play you a clip from the second of the films I'm talking about in this episode, and I'll pick up the story the other side of this.
California, here we come!
But they aren't the only ones. Because this is the Cannonball Run, America's illegal Grand Prix. And it doesn't matter how you get there. It's who gets there first. Burt Reynolds is the defending champion. On his team, Farrah Fawcett.
Are you one of those volleyballers?
Cannonballs. Dom DeLuise and Jack Elam. And here comes the competition.
Will you hurry up, you little...
Dean Martin.
We happen to be in a race.
Sammy Davis Jr.
You, Shorty. Where'd you get all that jewelry?
Take a left. Mel Tillis and Terry Bradshaw. Jackie Chan. And Roger Moore as himself.
I'm Roger Moore. Roger Moore.
And that is a clip from 1991's The Cannonball Run, directed by Hal Needham, written by Brock Yates, and with an extensive cast that includes, deep breath, Burt Reynolds, Roger Moore, Farrah Fawcett, Dom DeLuise, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Adrienne Barbeau, Tara Buttman, Jamie Farr, Jackie Chan in there as well. I mean, the list could go on and fill a podcast all by itself. But what couldn't fill a podcast is basically the story behind the film, because you don't always need an awful lot of plot to fill a movie, and in the case of The Cannonball Run, you don't really get it. Now, this was a film that was inspired by a race that had run a few times called the Cannonball Baker Sea to Shining Sea Memorial Trophy Dash. And it had gone a few times, and the idea was very simple. You start people in place A, and they have to get to place B however they like via road as quickly as they can. The mode of transport, as long as it's got wheels and runs on the road, entirely up to them. The route, entirely up to them. And the race was the brainchild of an automotive writer by the name of Brock Yates, but he also had a background in other kinds of writing as well, and he was friends with a legendary Hollywood stuntman by the name of Hal Needham. And now Needham would eventually turn his hand to directing movies as well, and the pair of them had a conversation about this particular project. Needham, after all, had earned himself some currency off the back of the hit movie Smokey and the Bandit, starring Burt Reynolds. And as Needham explains in his memoir, Stuntman, My Car-Crashing, Plane-Jumping, Bone-Breaking, Death-Defying Hollywood Life, it's quite a book, they had a chat where Needham suggested to Brock Yates, what if next time you run the race, you and I drive it together, we'll give every racer a tape recorder and pen and paper, they can record the outrageous things that happen to them along the way, then, along with past incidents, we'll compile everything into a script and look for a studio that also thinks it's exciting, funny and and unique enough to make into a movie. Well, Brock Yates was game for that. And in an interview he gave with the website Cannonball Run Pit Stop, he said, I'd met Hal before, and he was attempting to set a land speed record for the rocket car, and I'd come out to work on some magazine and television stuff. So I'd met Hal, we were good friends. For some reason or other, we got to be good buddies, and the pair of them did this race together. They went in an ambulance. That was their mode of transport, and the ambulance would make it into the final resultant film that would come out of this. And so they decided, yeah, let's try this. Once they got to the end of doing the race themselves, it was down to Brock Yates to put this into some kind of screenplay. Now, he left a little, as much as they'd recorded what was going on, he did leave a little bit of distance between real life and fiction. As he said in that interview, he said the ambulance was really the central piece in Cannonball Run. There were a couple of cars that actually ran in the event, and he just said the movie was really placed against the event. He said, we did New York to Los Angeles just like we did, but other than that, it was all fictional. And so at one stage, he'd originally planned to do the film a bit more serious than ultimately it ended up on screen. But it was a producer by the name of Al Ruddy who advised him in the end to play up the comedy. Now, Al Ruddy came in, and I'll go back to Needham's book as he picks this story up. He came in at Needham's invitation. He said, back in Hollywood, I got a call from a producer called Albert Al Ruddy, who produced The Godfather, and he said he called and told me he wanted to talk about the Cannonball script, financing, and all the details that go into putting together a movie. And so after the first meeting didn't quite go to plan, when Needham wasn't on time, very, very against character, he was just delayed. He said Ruddy was on time for our second meeting, and we got down to business. And Ruddy told Needham that he knew he had control of the Cannonball Run script, that he wanted to produce it. And Needham said, I said, that's all fair and good, but we need some money. This wasn't going to be a particularly cheap film to make. And that's where Al Ruddy pulled his trump card. And he said he knew a producer in Hong Kong named Raymond Chow. Chow had produced all of Jackie Chan's movies and was looking to break into the American film market. And so Ruddy said that Chow had plenty of money and wanted to go big time on his first Hollywood movie. And so this seemed like an ideal project. And so in came Golden Harvest Productions from Hong Kong with the checkbook. From the Hollywood side, 20th Century Fox liked the idea of this one, and why wouldn't they? Hal Needham had delivered Smokey and the Bandit for Universal. That had gone on to make lots of money, and thus there was a plan forming to get this film going. So Brock Yates wanted Steve McQueen to star in the movie, and Steve McQueen wanted to get involved in it as well. He was the logical star for the film, he felt, but McQueen had fallen ill and ultimately had to drop out of the project. And I mean, by the time it came out, McQueen would have passed away as well. And so the name Burt Reynolds came up. Now, Reynolds had been the star of Smokey and the Bandit, but also he was coming to a career crossroads. He was making a different kind of movie for Paramount Pictures next, called Paternity, but they went to him with the offer for the Cannonball Run. And as Reynolds writes in his own memoir, But Enough About Me, he said, by 1980, I'd done a string of car chase movies, and he lists White Lightning, Gator, Smokey and the Bandit 1 and 2, Hooper. And he said, I wanted to try other genre and swore that I wouldn't drive a car over the speed limit in another film. He was absolutely adamant about this. And he said, then Hal and the automotive writer Brock Yates came up with the Cannonball Run, a script based on an illegal cross-country car race. Now, Reynolds wasn't particularly enamoured with this idea when it first was presented to him, but he writes a slightly different version in his memoir. He said, it sounded like so much fun, I couldn't resist, and I was paid $5 million to make it. Now, $5 million in the early 1980s was a record salary for a movie star. Burt Reynolds, of course, at this point was one of the biggest stars in the world. And he talked about how a year after Smokey and the Bandit, I couldn't get my phone calls returned. I'd chosen too many films because I liked the location or the leading lady, or because I'd be working with friends. And Reynolds would write, if the script was crap, I rationalised that I could make it better, and I usually did, but it was just better crap. And so Needham talked too about the fact that a critic had made mention of the fact that Burt Reynolds needed to spread out into other genre of film, and thus this mandate that he wasn't going to be in a film where the speed limit went over 35 miles per hour. But they did a little bit of work to persuade him. Now, one of which was writing him an enormous cheque, and that did persuade Burt Reynolds to sign on the dotted line as well. Paramount wasn't happy though, because Paramount wanted him to star in Paternity, and this was going to end up with legal problems. And so they came up with an offer whereby Reynolds would only have to work on the film for 14 days for his $5 million. Furthermore, that they would shoot his stuff, then they would shut down production so that Reynolds could go off and do the picture reshoots for another film he'd just done for Paramount called Rough Cut. And so in the midst of all of this, a deal was being hatched out that there was the funding for a budget of $13 to $15 million in the end, were the amounts that have been cited. Again, a lot for the time. And Reynolds agreed. He took the money. He got the headlines of the world's most expensive movie star. And again, he was only going to have to work 2 weeks for his money. So, once Reynolds was in, the rest of the cast could come together, and it was a case of using people in your contacts book who you'd met before, or, I mean, Jackie Chan came in off the back of the involvement of Golden Harvest Productions, and that casting dream team was coming together, all lured in by the fact that you can come and appear in this movie that's going to be a big, expensive Hollywood movie. You're not actually going to need to work more than a few days on it a piece. And so people like Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. were lured in off the back of that. Dom DeLuise signed on the dotted line as well. Now, the most contentious piece of casting would turn out to be Roger Moore. Now, Roger Moore at that point was James Bond 007. He was contracted to Albert R. Broccoli's Eon Productions to make more James Bond films. And he basically, I don't think it's going particularly legally problematic to say that the character effectively he plays in the Cannonball Run is James Bond. But, as you heard in the clip that I played at the start, he's billed as Roger Moore playing Roger Moore. But it's Roger Moore being James Bond, but being Roger Moore, from what most people could tell. And that was certainly the view, too, of the legendary Bond producer Albert R. Broccoli, because he got interested, well, in just how Moore was portraying his character, and he wasn't best happy about it. And Moore would subsequently, while he was on the press tour for one of his later books, admit that he'd done a deal with Broccoli not to do anything to damage the character of James Bond. But other than that, he doesn't write extensively about the film in his memoir, short of the fact that he got a chance to meet Dean Martin, and he was there at the time that Martin was shooting his own sequences. The film was a go, and he was on the starting line in early May 1980 in Atlanta, and this was the bit where they got Reynolds to do all of his scenes together first. Now, because this was a race, Reynolds needed to appear at the start, the middle, and the end of the race. They couldn't just shoot all of his stuff in the same location, so basically they had to run it all twice. That they had to do all of Reynolds' scenes, and then they had to move all the way to Las Vegas and shoot all the western states and the desert, as Needham explained, to Los Angeles for the end of the movie. And then once Reynolds was released from his commitment, then they had to go right the way back to Atlanta to shoot all the scenes that didn't involve Burt Reynolds, and shoot the film in two pretty much identical style of blocks. Needham argued it was an extra expense, but you do what you do to make it work. Now, also having to be built into the schedule for this one was that Needham was hard at work on another movie as well, that he was in post-production on Smokey and the Bandit 2, which had been demanded by the studio, and everyone had signed up for it and was eagerly awaited. And so it needed to be a 3-week gap in the midst of it all so that Needham could head back to the edit suite to finish that particular film off. Now, when he was back on the set of the Cannonball Run, he was very involving of the cast and crew, that he would show them the footage every single day that had been, and this was uncommon really at the time, that it's the era where everything was shot on film, so it had to be sent away to be developed, and then you could come back and have a look at what had been shot. But he was keeping people involved with the material that was going to be appearing on the screen. And then, of course, the ambulance that he and Brock Yates had driven in the real race, that was also making it into the movie as well. But there's also a tragic story in the midst of the shooting of the Cannonball Run when in June 1980 a stunt on the film went very, very horribly wrong, and it would have ramifications for the stunt community in the aftermath of the movie. Now, the story centres on a stunt performer called Heidi von Beltz, who had been called in as a last-minute replacement to do one of the stunts on the film. Now, there were various stories of allegedly lax safety conditions with some of the stunts, with some of the cars. Some of the cars weren't in great shape on screen, but also weren't in great shape for real as well. Things like bald tyres, and they'd been battered around a lot. But also what they'd done ahead of shooting is they'd taken seatbelts out of lots of the cars. And so when Heidi von Beltz got into a vehicle to perform a stunt, her vehicle then crashed head on with another, and there wasn't a seatbelt there to break the impact. The ramifications of this were horrible, that her neck was broken and it left her severely disabled for the rest of her life. The ensuing legal cases went on for many, many years as well. And it would, in time, she would be awarded a 7-figure payout for the accident on the movie, but also this was severely depleted after costs and assorted appeals, and it left a very significant black mark on the production. It would be around the end of June 1980 that the Cannonball Run would wrap up filming. In all, it had done around 30 days of actual shooting. It's just it had to be split into various different bits and bobs. And the editing was soon wrapped up, and a test screening was being organised by 20th Century Fox ahead of the film's release. Now, Needham was a man of many talents, and one of them was racing in NASCAR as well. He was involved in a NASCAR team. And as such, at the point the test screening was organised, he was actually having a race, and he would have to come back. In fact, he was driving past after the race where the screening was taking place, and at first couldn't get in. He wasn't on the guest list for the screening, and he wasn't recognised. And it took a little bit of time before he could go into the screening, and in time really to hear what he described as the usual BS of people saying how wonderful everything is and how great it is. And I think he always tended to take that with a pinch of salt. His interviews were always hugely entertaining. Now, 20th Century Fox was getting confident about this one. It had the biggest movie star in the world. It had a very, very mainstream commercial film. And so it set a release date in the end of June the 19th, 1981, for the release of the movie. And it went before critics. And you can roughly guess how this one played out. That it didn't particularly impress an awful lot of people, and playing to the lowest common denominator and going for heavy mainstream with not an awful lot in it. And I think also, I've rewatched the Cannonball Run ahead of this. It is a series of sketches, really. There's no real story thread through it all, short of you've got a race from here to there, and it's stretched out to, a 90-minute runtime. And so it's not a film without problems, but it's a film you watch more for its moments than anything else, I would suggest. That said, an awful lot of people chose to watch it. That at a point where opening weekends weren't a huge thing, it landed in American cinemas that weekend, June the 19th or 21st, 1981. Didn't open in first place. That honour went to a film I'm coming to in the future on this podcast, Superman 2, which grossed $14.1 million. But the Cannonball Run was a hit, $11.7 million. Its opening weekend in America. Raiders of the Lost Ark dropped down a couple of places when those two films came along. But also this one had endurance. The week after, the new Bond film with Roger Moore opened, For Your Eyes Only. That could open in third place because Superman 2 and the Cannonball Run were helping themselves to all the cash at the box office. And in fact, in the end, this was a gigantic hit. That the Cannonball Run grossed $160 million worldwide, an enormous amount for a film at that point in movie history. It wasn't winning any awards or anything like that, but it did soon lead to a sequel being ordered in double quick time. That would come out in 1984. Burt Reynolds again would lead the cast, even though he didn't like to be in films where he went at 35 miles per hour or faster. But the fact that his fee also included a percentage of the profits meant that the Cannonball Run made him a very, very rich man if he wasn't very rich in the first place. It was 1981's sixth highest grossing film in America, behind things like Superman 2, Raiders of the Lost Ark. Stripes was in the midst there as well. And a franchise would be launched. There were some afters to this one outside of the Heidi Van Belt's court case and compensation claim. Hal Needham found himself up for a James Bond film at one point, and he had a meeting with Albert R. Broccoli. And when Needham met him, Broccoli just turned to him and said, "Perhaps we should think about suing you for Cannonball Run." Likewise, Roger Moore in 1985, he'd never sued him for Cannonball Run to be fair, but Roger Moore in 1985 did sue the film. That he filed a lawsuit against Eurasia Investments and Golden Harvest for what he said in his contract entitled him to 5% of the profits as well. That Moore argued that he was owed $134,000 that they hadn't paid up. I couldn't find out exactly what happened with that claim in the end, short of the fact that the legal ramifications were still going on. Reynolds, though, would lament that I did that film in the end for all the wrong reasons. He said, "I never liked it. I did it to help out a friend of mine, Hal Needham, and I also felt it was immoral to turn down that kind of money." He said, "I suppose I sold out, so I couldn't really object to what people wrote about me, and people did indeed start writing things about him. His commercial star would dwindle over the ensuing years, and the Cannonball Run sequel didn't really reignite it either." Still, there is still talk that the flame of the Cannonball Run itself could flicker on, that in 2016 Hollywood nearly ended up with a remake of it, that Warner Brothers had picked up the rights to do that and hired Ethan Coen to write and direct a new Cannonball Run movie. That fizzled out over time, but not completely, because in 2018 the new name behind the camera for it was set to be Doug Liman, the director of films like Edge of Tomorrow and The Bourne Identity. However, once again, I mean, Lyman's slate has always had more than a fair few projects on it, and this one just appears to have fizzled and not gone anywhere. Which leaves us really with the original Cannonball Run, the second Cannonball Run, and then a film called Speed Zone, which was also branded at one point as Cannonball Run 3, but also a legacy of a bunch of films in the 70s and 80s that just involved a load of cars going fast across America. If you look really at the infancy of the Fast and Furious franchise, you might be able to trace it right the way back to films such as those. Which all brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for listening and thank you for your time. If I've not completely bored you, you can get more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can get more from the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories Pod as well. At our website, filmstories.co.uk, you'll find that's updated every weekday with movie news, reviews, features, mayhem, all sorts of bits going on there. I've already plugged the shop, so let me just remind you of the URL, store.filmstories.co.uk, to buy magazines and Blu-rays and bits and bobs. We're at Facebook, facebook.com/filmstoriesonline, YouTube, youtube.com/filmstories. And I have a live show coming up just over a week from when this podcast is being released. Depending when you're listening to this, this will either be a useful notice or a completely irrelevant notice. I'm at the Midlands Arts Centre in Birmingham in the UK on Wednesday the 30th of March. Tickets are on sale for that now. That's in the year 2022, depending just when you're listening to this. Again, you can find more on that at filmstories.co.uk. For now, the most important thing is that you're all staying safe and you're all looking after yourselves and you're all well. I'm going to go off and watch another load of films. I'll be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Until then, you all take care. Look after yourselves. Bye-bye.
Sorry, not yet. Come back later.
Arnold Schwarzenegger, last action hero, the big ticket for '93.